When you talk hormetic response, so this is one of those where like we'll hit a point where it goes into black box territory for me, where I can give you it's hormetic. The body like responds to a mild stressor by getting stronger, but I don't actually know what the fuck is happening.
Yeah.
Do you know what is happening in a hormetic response? Is it vary depending on what the thing is, or are there like your breakdown of rapamycin and mTOR and all that? Like I can follow the train of logic, but with this, how does something that releases a toxin, how does that become a detox pathway?
I think because our bodies overcompensate. I think because our
by
bodies
doing what?
By upregulating the NRF2 pathway, creating detox compounds like glutathione,
that snatch us up, make it water soluble, or bind it so that we can urinate.
Yeah, it basically creates more
perspire.
glutathione than would be needed to disarm this compound. And that has an overall protective, effect on the body.
Right.
So sulforaphane has been shown to boost glutathione in the brain, which is amazing. Glutathione, a decrement of glutathione is associated with depression, dementia, and things like that. And then also I think that, and this is sort of the new frontier for science, it probably is also having a hormetic effect on the microbiota, like the bacteria that live in our large intestine. And this is sort of, relatively unexplored territory, but certain compounds like polyphenols, which also act as hormetic stressors, xenohormesis, are actually not all that bioavailable to us. Like their absorption in through the digestive tract into circulation is actually pretty low, and yet the consumption of foods with polyphenols is related to all kinds of good things in terms of your health. So it's probably not 100% the case that these compounds are being absorbed and, we're even detoxing them, but it's probably via their, consumption by, gut bacteria that's releasing all these metabolites that then get released into circulation. So there's all these different potential mechanisms, but that's where I think where I'm kind of at odds with people that are on the carnivore diet, because it's like, when you heat meat, for one, you're creating all kinds of toxic compounds. And, I think in isolation.
Is that true if you're not charring it? You're saying no matter what, heat, compounds?
No, I mean, charring is probably the worst, but I would be a very poor excuse for a carnivore because I like to cook my meat on a barbecue occasionally. And so inevitably you're going to be creating heterocyclic amines. You're going to be creating AGEs, which is the Maillard reaction, which is why meat browns. And those compounds and others, those are not necessarily good for you. I think the benefits of eating meat outweigh any potential negatives that you get from those compounds, especially when, you eat the meat in the context of a diet that includes vegetables and fiber and things like that. So I think it's important to have both.
Yeah, that debate goes back and forth. And I find it so, if I'm really honest, it's a convenience thing. So because I find it so convenient to not have to prep vegetables, and I so enjoy the way I feel when I'm eating red meat, that I go in on it pretty hard.
Yeah, I go in on it pretty hard, I would say. I mean, I do think that dietary fiber is important, and it's like, in a way, you're kind of grasping at straws when it comes to nutrition, because you have the gold standard of research that can prove cause and effect is a randomized control trial. And we're never going to have long-term, large population RCTs in humans that can prove the benefits of one diet over another, especially these niche diets like carnivore diets versus a more omnivorous paleo diet. And so I think on the one hand, you want to kind of like hedge your bets, but on the other, I think that there's enough information where we can say that certain plant compounds are in fact very good for us. And I also think in terms of like just your overall happiness quotient and dietary diversity, and the microbiome, the microbiota, I think it's important to include these kinds of foods.
One thing you talk about in the book, though, is that just diversity of diet is not necessarily that important, and that there's a few things that if you go and you buy them and just cycle around on these things, that you're probably better off.
Yeah.
What are those things? What are the like 5 or 10 things that we should be buying and eating?
So that's a good, I'm glad you brought that up. So Darius Mozafarian, he's a nutrition researcher. He's done a study, and I cite it in the book, where, most people say, they parrot the old adage of eating everything in moderation. But when you look at a person's diet, people that tend to have more varied diets tend to be including more confectionery products, sugar sweetened beverages, and things like that. So what I found is that the healthiest people tend to buy a narrower range of foods and just eat the same foods on loop. And so I try to highlight foods that have the highest capacity for nutrient density, that are going to basically give your body what it needs. Because when you look around statistically, most people are going to be nutrient deficient in at least one essential nutrient, whether it's a vitamin or mineral or essential fatty acid or the like. 90% of people actually are deficient in at least one essential nutrient. And so for me, when I'm going to the supermarket, I'm really making an effort to shop around the perimeter. And this is probably advice that you've had on your show many times. It's not rocket science, but I think it's important to reiterate that most supermarkets are designed the same way, that the fresh perishable food is found around the perimeter, and it's the aisles where the ultra-processed foods lie in wait. And those ultra-processed foods, they're tempting, but we now overconsume them. About 60% of the calories that your average person consumes comes from these kinds of foods. And for all the variety that the modern supermarket might present you the illusion of, most of the calories that we're consuming are coming from just 3 plants: wheat, corn, and rice, pulverized and ground into a dust and devoid of essential nutrients. In fact, they often have to be added back in their synthetic form. That's why if you look at most commercial breads or wheat snacks, they're all fortified with niacin, with folic acid, with all these, because most people are nutrient deficient. And that's because the standard American diet basically encourages those nutrient deficiencies. So I advocate for, grass-fed beef, wild salmon, dark leafy greens, cruciferous vegetables, nuts, seeds, berries, things like that. But in this book, I think where I depart from Genius Foods is I talk a lot about the value of dietary protein. I think dietary protein is crucially important, especially for a population that is by and large overweight. I think protein is a crucial thing to try to prioritize at every meal. It's not only the most satiating of the macronutrients.
You think more than fat?
I think more than fat, for sure. In fact, there's a hypothesis, it's called the protein leverage hypothesis, that our hunger mechanisms are basically dictated by our requirement for amino acids. So when you eat the protein that your body requires, it basically turns off your hunger mechanisms. And people who undereat protein tend to eat more carbs and fat. Not only that, but protein is thermogenically favorable. In fact, you burn...
What do you mean by that?
Well, fat has 9 calories per gram.
Yep.
Protein and carbs have 4 calories per gram, but actually protein has 3 calories per gram when you consider that about a third of the calories that you consume in the form of protein are burned off via digestion. It's the thermic effect of feeding, and protein has the highest thermic effect.
I have literally never heard of that. How's that possible?
Yeah, it's basically 3 calories per gram.
So you're saying the energy that it takes me to run the cycle of digesting the food?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's satiating.
So, sorry, as a percentage of the calories that it has, it is harder for me, essentially, to digest protein. Takes more energy. I don't want to use the wrong words here.
Yes.
So, because obviously, that's interesting. So, round numbers, you're saying it takes a calorie to burn protein.
Yeah.
How many calories does it take to burn fat?
I believe it's about 5 to 10%. So like a fraction of a calorie.
Wow. So it's 25% to burn protein. What about carbs?
It's about 20 to 30%. Carbs, similar to fat, it's about 5 to 10%.
Whoa.
Very low. Yeah.
Interesting.
Carbs are easily assimilated because glucose is important for survival. So, I mean, basically when you consume a complex carbohydrate, the carbs are cleaved. A complex carbohydrate is basically a long chain of glucose. That are essentially broken down. I mean, even as you begin chewing a starch, the amylase enzyme in your saliva begins to break down the carbohydrate. And fat has a very low thermic effect as well. But protein, about 30%. So
I had no idea.
Yeah, it's also, as I mentioned, it's satiating. It fills you up. And it's crucial for maintaining and building muscle mass, which, we know is important. And I think people tend to, underappreciate protein. But if you think about it, it's rare that you'll overeat chicken breast or a piece of fish. That doesn't happen with protein. It happens with hyperpalatable processed foods. It happens with, a baked potato that you throw butter on top of. Like those are very easy foods to overconsume. Protein is not all that difficult to overconsume. So
it's interesting. So I agree that you're not likely to overeat protein. But I did rabbit starvation for about 2 years. So for people that haven't heard that term before, rabbit starvation is where you're basically getting, I probably was intaking about 85% of my calories in the form of literally chicken breast. So it's just protein.
Wow.
And it's a miserable way to live. But I would say that it was boring, but I was probably... In terms of calories, it's hard to say because you're right. I could probably eat more calories of fat, but like I did a 4-to-1 ketogenic diet for a while, far more miserable than doing rabbit starvation. It was grotesque. All of your meals are soft and gross. And that was like, I didn't want to eat. That was the first diet where, and when I say 4-to-1, I mean for every combined gram of protein and carbohydrate, I ate 4 grams of fat. It's a horrifying way to live.
Wow.
And I was in ketosis, homie, and I was also doing caloric restriction. So there was that added to the misery. I had never been fat adapted. So there was keto flu, like all of that. I get it. That was part of the not fun. But in terms of like the actual meal itself, they were kind of gross. So I did not find myself compelled to overeat at that stage.
It's just super oily meals.
Super oily.
Yeah.
Super oily.
Yeah. I'm not a big high fat advocate. I mean, I think it's
I'm going to need you to define high fat.
Yeah.
Because that is the one, this is all anecdote. I fully get it. High fat changed my fucking life forever. Because when I did the 4-to-1 diet, I went from, I had iced my wrists every night for 15 years.
Wow.
Because I was just in a chronic state of inflammation, which, trust me, when I die young, I'll be very angry about those years of just knowing nothing about diet. So for 15 years, have all this inflammation, just think, hey, that's the way that I am, tough break kid. And then I meet Peter Attia and Dom D'Agostino, and they're like, hey, moron, eat fat. And I was like, dude, I don't want to get fat. I just spent 2 years getting lean. And they were like, basically... They were so kind, but more or less, dumbass, fat does not make you fat. I can't believe I had to go through all of this. So the thing that everybody goes through where it's like, what do you mean fat's going to make me fat? Like, I get it. If it had been named anything else, I think people wouldn't misunderstand it the way that they do. It's literally called the thing that people don't want to be. So I had to go through that. I do the 4-to-1 because I'm thinking cancer protection. So I really like... we were talking before about change or die. I'm one of those people, dude. Yeah. I can make any change I need to if I think that it's going to give me something that I want. So definitely want to live as long as humanly possible. So when I was told, hey, do a therapeutic ketogenic diet, 4-to-1, get in this range where basically the ratio of your glucose, your blood glucose to your ketone levels, I forget now what the percentage was, it's years ago, but I did that, totally misery, like I said, but my joint pain went away in 2 days. And so I was like, holy shit. Like I had no idea that was possible. I didn't know there was anything I could do to get rid of that pain. I had tried everything. Do you know prolotherapy?
I do not know.
All right. So they inject a dextrose solution into the joint.
Wow.
And I went and it's basically sugar water. So the thinking is it's low-grade inflammation. Your body is sort of numb to it. It's no longer responding with resolving the issue. So let's hit it with this sugar water solution, cause massive inflammation, and the body will go and resolve the issue. So I was doing that for a while and like didn't help, nothing helped. Like it just seemed like a forever thing. So in 48 hours to go from this is a chronic issue in my life where I have to ice. I was icing so much I had burn marks on the back of my wrists from just having ice on them so often, and to my wrists feel normal. It was like taking a drug. So I immediately, after I did it for, I forget, 10 days, 3 weeks, something, doing the 4-to-1, as soon as the time that I'd committed to doing it was over, I stopped. But I was like, I will never take fat out of my diet again because this seems incredibly powerful. That was... I'm going to guess close to 10 years ago. I haven't had the joint pain since. Dude, it's bananas. So in terms of like that the evangelical person who has lived through it. I am like a born again Christian with this shit. I am so diehard to get people to try ketogenics. I think everybody has to try it. It may not work for you. I fully get that. There are definitely people that either don't respond or respond negatively. That's all real. The amount of diversity of reaction is fucking staggering. 10 years ago, you could not have convinced me that like humans have such a varied response. Like we have a kid here, name's Will, Vietnamese kid. He can fucking pack away carbohydrates like there's no tomorrow and whole food, but he can pack away rice by the pound and he's lean as the day is long. If I ate that same amount of rice, you would hear me get fatter. I'm not joking. Like I've run these experiments. So I can't do it. I'll get inflamed. I'll start getting joint pain. So he and I could eat the same thing and have wildly different responses. My wife and I, we can eat the same thing and have wildly different responses. Legitimately, eating the same thing for us will put her in the hospital. I don't mean that as an exaggeration. I actually mean it will put her in the hospital because she has microbiome issues. So can totally fuck her up. But even before she had that problem, if we ate she is half my size, dude. Half. If we ate the same amount of calories, literally bite for bite, she wouldn't gain weight, but she would sweat at night and I would gain weight.
Wow.
And I was like, I'm twice your fucking size. It's crazy. So the level of variability is massive. So I get that. But I think everybody should try it because if you're anything like me and for decades you're eating damaged fats and those damaged fats are causing inflammation. So I have a high inflammation response. Strike 2 in my desire to live forever. High inflammation response. So I have, there's a name for it. It's something graphia on the skin. So you can write in my skin, not as much now, but when I was younger, you could take your fingernail and write your name and it would welt up on my skin. So I have like a very high inflammation response, which explains the risks, but I was eating damaged fats. I had no concept that like trans fat was a thing. You want to hurt a little to hear how I grew up?
I do actually. Yeah.
So thank you. So my mom didn't want me, she wanted me, so I argued about food. I had like real food trauma as a kid and I was a super picky eater. And so finally at 13, my mom was just tired of arguing with me about it. So she said, fine, you can make your own food. So I wanted to make chicken nuggets because of course we had a deep fat fryer in the house as you do in Tacoma.
Damn.
And she said, no way, you can't have chicken nuggets. They're not good for you, but you can have turkey nuggets and French fries. So I ate deep fried turkey nuggets and French fries almost every night for 5 years.
Wow.
From the time I was 13 until I graduated high school. And that, of course, was exactly why I was inflamed. And then I go to college and don't know any better, so I keep eating bad food. Like when I first went low carb, I would go to Panda Express. I would get orange chicken, but no rice. Because I had no concept that sugar could hide in a sauce. That didn't make sense to me. So I had years of intaking things in places that I didn't realize I was intaking them. So getting your fat source right, not taking in damaged fats, getting healthy fats. I think for a lot of people that struggle with inflammation, it is admittedly a game of not eating a lot of things. But then because I went for 2 years, literally, dude, this is so close to accurate that I'll just make this statement. All I ate was steamed broccoli and boiled chicken breast. So I'm not the guy that's like, I'm eating chicken and broccoli. I don't understand the problem. And then you watch me eat it and I've got orange sauce on it. And, you know, I'm putting like all these different sauces and dressings. And it was boiled fucking chicken breast and steamed broccoli. And I got shredded. So
I've seen the photos on your Instagram.
Hey, it worked from that perspective. But from a joint inflammation perspective, it was a nightmare. So for sure, it was the addition of fat because I had already removed all of the pro-inflammatory stuff. So this was a deficiency in either just the fat or whatever all the other things are that red meat contains. And maybe that's it. Maybe it's not the fat, but
well, there's no doubt that certain fats are good for you. So I guess I should clarify. I'm not against high fat at all because I am very interested in a ketogenic diet, and in fact, I think I advocate for seasonal ketosis, or at the very least intermittent ketosis, whatever that means to you. I think it's important to on a maybe daily, monthly, seasonal basis to allow your brain access to ketones, which are a quote unquote super fuel that can supply 60% of your brain's energy, which is now being studied for, it's been used for over a century for, to treat hard to treat epilepsy. And now it's being studied for its efficacy in improving memory in Alzheimer's disease patients and things like that. But I'm not very big on lots of added oil in the diet, which I think, once people started becoming interested in high fat diets, now suddenly the pendulum swang in the other direction where people were putting. Because
I thought you were all about olive oil.
I am. So to a point, I think it's important to integrate olive oil into your diet. I'll use, a liter a week. I use it fairly liberally. But when it comes to like throwing coconut oil in my smoothie or butter in my coffee, I do occasionally enjoy butter in my coffee. I like the taste. But I think it's important to remember, and we've been saying this in the fitness community, as I'm sure you know, for years, don't drink your calories. You don't want to do the same. You want to basically adhere to the same advice when it comes to oil too, because oil is not a very nutrient dense food. It's very calorie dense. It's not nutrient dense. But I don't make any restrictions on the fats naturally contained in whole foods. So nuts, seeds, grass-fed beef, dark meat, chicken, things like that.
What nuts do you eat?
Well, people will debate about phytic acid and things like that, but
what do you eat?
Well, I like almonds. Almonds are a great source of magnesium and
Raw?
vitamin E. I like them raw.
Okay.
I'm not too concerned with the phytate in almond skins or, anything like that. I'll try to soak them, when I have the opportunity, but often.
You soak them?
If you soak them.
They're gross.
They become gross.
What do you do with them? Do you re-dry them? Because like my wife, when she went through the whole microbiome disaster, the doctor was like, hey, try soaking the almonds. And it was fucking gross. She was like, I'd rather just not eat them.
They can get slimy. The last time I did it, which was a few weeks ago, I soaked them and then I tossed them in olive oil and then a little bit of sea salt and I roasted them.
They were still wet.
They actually came out really good. If you just soak them, they can become, I think, a bit slimy.
But you soak them and then get rid of the slime by just putting olive oil on them? I don't understand. I keep waiting for some drying process.
Yeah.
No drying. Have you ever had sprouted nuts?
Maybe that's what I did. Well,
but sprouted nuts, I'm almost certain, go through a drying process. At least when you eat them, they're dry as fuck. So you
soak them in a jar and then you pour out the liquid and then they dry during the last.
For how long?
I think I did it for 3 days.
Okay, maybe we just fucking did it wrong, but they were gnarly. Now, sprouted nuts, which I think they sprout by soaking, but by the time they are packaged, they are dry and delicious. And this is one of those where I would not have believed. So if you take pecans that have been they do every bad thing to them you can imagine. They put all the wonderful, delicious, and deadly oils on it, which taste fucking awesome. I actually like the sprouted pecans better. So it's one of the few times where the thing that I like better is actually better for me. But I get down with sprouted nuts. So what else? You've got almonds that you soak.
Yeah, although I'll often, if I'm traveling and I buy, I'll occasionally buy a bag of raw almonds. So I'll eat them like that. I'll use slivered almonds as a condiment. Sometimes I'll throw them into a salad. But I get a lot of fat I eat a lot of red meat. I eat a lot of fatty fish. I eat a lot of dark meat chicken.
So wait a second. I want to go back to the nuts. You only eat almonds? So when you say nuts, you mean almonds?
Macadamia nuts are great because they're very high in monounsaturated fat. I've been eating a lot of Brazil nuts lately for the selenium.
I can't deal with those.
I love those, actually. I used to not.
What does selenium help with?
Selenium is an important antioxidant in the brain. It's crucially important, and it's also crucially important for thyroid health. So it actually helps.
Can't you eat too many Brazil nuts?
Yes.
I heard that somewhere.
Yeah.
So how many are you eating a day?
3 to 4. You want to be kind of conscious of your selenium intake. It's similar to vitamin A. You don't want to like overconsume retinol, which is the active form of vitamin A.
Super weird vitamin A story. Is it true that polar bear liver has some like obscene amount of vitamin A? That's what I heard. Like there was some crazy story about these guys trapped in a cabin in like Antarctica. Did you hear about this? Fucking polar bears are evil, man.
Wow.
Straight evil. They're like, the fact that they're on Coca-Cola as like the sweet, cuddly thing, those motherfuckers are wildly intelligent and they will fuck you up.
Doesn't surprise me.
And so there's this whole story about these guys trapped and the fucking polar bears would trick them. And oh God, what'd they do? They would have like one standing out front and then the other one would actually attack through the back door. I don't remember the story well, but the punchline is they finally fucking kill these things. They're so like raged out about how they had been picking them off one by one. They eat the fuckers. but then one of them like dies or something from eating the liver because there was toxicity of
vitamin A toxicity. Yeah, it's super concentrated in bear liver.
That's so weird. That's so random.
So random. But, well, I mean, it's not that unusual because actually that's one of the reasons why liver from beef or chicken.
Why don't other animals have that same level of toxicity?
I don't know. I don't know exactly what my hypothesis would be, that bears are going to store a lot more stuff in the liver, which is a storage organ because they hibernate. So maybe they're storing vitamin A and all. I mean, you store vitamin B12 in your liver. You store all kinds of things. It's a storage organ for, choline, for different nutrients.
I just read something, and it may have been in your book. I just came across it, but forgive me if it wasn't in your book, talking about bears, and they have some specific reaction because of their need to hibernate. They don't have the muscle wasting. They store something in their fat. Nope, wasn't in your book. So you're not gonna be able to help me. I don't remember the exact factoid, but it was pretty interesting about something that bears. Oh God, this is a waste because I can't finish this off. But it was something, the mechanism by which bears spare their muscle. There was something for us to take away in terms of amino acids.
I mean, growth hormone is probably pretty conserved throughout the animal kingdom, or at least among mammals. And growth hormone, one of the things that helps to do is to preserve lean mass during a fasted state. It's one of the reasons why growth hormone becomes pretty sharply elevated when fasting.
Fasting is fucking interesting. You go pretty deep on that in the book.
Yeah.
You went into that, if I remember right, in the timing section.
In the timing section, yeah, because I have a section where I talk about our relationship with time and light, but also food. So light is the primary time setter that our brains use to get a sense of what time of day it is, which is important for the operation of pretty much every system in the body.
You talk about there being ancillary clocks, which I thought was really interesting. So it's not just the light; it's
also food. Yeah, it's also food. Food is a time setter because we have peripheral clocks. The master clock in the brain is called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and it's housed in the hypothalamus, which is a very primordial region of the brain. And within that structure, which controls everything from hunger to our drive for sex, it's at the base of the brain, essentially, which is where you'll find things that govern, aspects of our behavior that are important for survival.
Is it in the hypothalamus? It's actually wrapped inside of it?
Yeah, it's a little chocolate chip-sized region in that area, and it interfaces directly with our eyes, with proteins in our eyes called melanopsin proteins, which are light sensing, but they're not involved in vision. And that's pretty much our body's master clock setting apparatus. So when we perceive light at an intensity of about 1,000 lux or higher, that sets off the 24-hour rhythm that guides essentially, the run of show for, every system in the body. I had the privilege of interviewing Dr. Sachin Panda, who's a luminary in this field over at the Salk Institute for Biological Aging, and he was part of the team that discovered the melanopsin protein. And it's very interesting because there's only a few of the of these proteins in the eye, in the retina, and they are really there to kind of interface with that master clock system. And I think that's just another area of our biology where modern life really, tends to do a disservice to us, thrusting us all into a perpetual state of jet lag.
That's an interesting way to say it. What time do you eat your last meal?
I try to eat my last meal about 2 to 3 hours before bed.
I think you're making a mistake.
Why? What's your...
So I have a hypothesis. This is one of those things that...
Are you saying I should be eating way earlier?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
So I eat my last meal at 2 p.m. I'm done chewing at 2 p.m. So this all started, I could eat and go to bed literally within seconds and have no digestive problems whatsoever. My wife used to say, I really think I need time between my last meal and when I go to bed. And I was like, that doesn't make any sense. And she was like, no, I really feel like that sometimes, because she 4 years ago just got debilitated with digestive problems. And it was crazy. It was emergency rooms. It was like, what the fuck is happening? It was malnutrition. Are you going to die? Like, I was really scared. So we start looking at every fucking aspect. And she has this guess like, oh, I think that, and people weren't talking about this yet, at least not like the way that it's being talked about now where you can't avoid hearing about this. You hadn't written your fucking book yet. So let's start with that. Thank you for letting her suffer. No, I'm kidding. So she starts talking about like, hey, I think timing really matters. It didn't make sense to me. And she starts doing it and making me stay up for 3 hours because I'm not going to go to bed and leave her hanging. So like if we're on vacation or something, she would say, hey, you know, is there any way like because she likes to eat actually quite late. Is there any way that we can stay up? Like if we eat at 9, we stay up till midnight. Yeah, of course, baby, we'll do it. And she was like, I really think it's helping. And so it just naturally put me on that same rhythm. And I thought, that's interesting. Like now, even when I go like hardcore, I don't get an upset stomach. So like at Christmas time, I go off the rails. I'm having a lot of ice cream, all that. And I wasn't sure, is it the intermittent fasting? Because if I'm eating bad and I make sure that I fast for at least 16 hours, I'm golden. I can get away with murder. And so I thought, well, is it the length of fast or is it the number of hours? Because I find it much easier. Just if I'm going to clock, because when I'm really in it, I try to do 20-hour fasts daily. And that I feel I can stay lean easily. It gets a little hard. The last hour or two, admittedly, is like I have to like focus and alter my lifestyle. So I'm not trying to do something really cognitively demanding for the last 2 hours. But like I find that's a good rhythm for me, 19 to 20 hours. And so I started wondering though, like I definitely feel better. I can get away with more. But is it the length of fast? Is it the number of hours? Because if I'm going to go that long, I find it easier to eat my last meal late rather than trying to wake up and go 6 hours or 7 hours without eating. And because I wake up so fucking early, like I'm usually awake between 3 and 4 a.m. So with no alarm, it's just when I wake up. I go to bed at 9, I wake up. And so this Christmas when I went off the rails again, but this time I said, okay, I'm not going to worry so much about length of fast, but I'm really going to be hyper conscious about clocking 5 hours before I go to bed. Dude, cash money. Felt fucking amazing. Yeah. So I really want my wife, like if I feel a benefit and I'm somebody that's got a pretty robust digestion, I want my wife to try 5 hours. I actually think most people think they're being just a fucking rock star at 3. I have a gut instinct that you're actually better like 4 and 5 hours before bed.
Well, I think you're probably right. I think that the ideal time to stop eating would probably be around 7 p.m. I mean, it depends on the time.
Why is that ideal? Is that a sunset thing or
something
else?
Yeah, because, well, you know, we're diurnal creatures, right? We're diurnal. We're meant to, you know, eat and do most of the things that we're going to do that are going to require the greatest energy expenditure during the day. And you know, we know that as night approaches and the sun begins to set and melatonin levels start to creep up and cortisol levels start to drop, that daylight associated activity sort of is, you know, becomes less supported in the body. And that includes digestion and metabolism. And that's one of the reasons why we become less insulin sensitive later in the day. But also digestion falters to some degree. I mean, peristalsis slows, which is the transit of, you know, food components through the GI tract. So I think you're probably better off stopping eating by like 6 to 7 p.m. And in fact, the growing body of research in humans that's being done with early time restricted feeding also seems to back this up, that when we eat, you know, earlier dinners, it seems to be to the benefit of our metabolic health independent of weight loss. Now, for somebody like you who's eating only within a 4-hour window, it's almost impossible, I think, within those 4 hours to overconsume calories. So, I mean,
my friend, come over. I'll show you how.
Really?
Do you not know about slippery foods, homie?
I'm interested. Well, what are you eating? Whole, minimally processed foods?
The reality is, in my 4-hour window, I don't overeat, and because if I overeat, then I can still put on fat for sure in a 4-hour window, no problem. I could if I wasn't cognizant of what I'm eating, I could easily clock, and I'm talking every single day of my life, I could easily clock in that 4-hour window 4,000, 5,000 calories. That'd be pretty easy. I'd have to have ice cream. There's no question. So this was the term slippery foods comes from the gastric bypass community or lap band community, where they have a smaller amount of space. So they get tricky, like the ones who sort of give up on staying on the straight and narrow. realized that if you eat things like ice cream that's like really sort of liquidy, that you can pack a lot of fucking calories.
Well, that makes sense because ice cream is an ultra-processed foods, and ultra-processed foods are defined in part because of the fact that they are so calorie dense. And that's one of the reasons why we see the obesity epidemic that we're now seeing, because these foods, you know, essentially short-circuit our brain satiety checkpoints. So if you're trying to eat, for example, the genius foods, you know, super nutrient dense foods within that 4-hour window, which we know are the foods that are going to be the best for you, you know, which unfortunately doesn't include ice cream in that under that umbrella.
Much to my dismay.
I think it's probably going to be pretty difficult to overconsume calories. So, I mean, that is a good way of basically drawing a line in the sand and maintaining some level of calorie control. And probably what you're seeing are some of the benefits of calorie restriction, which we know are numerous. You know, it's a great way to reduce inflammation in smaller organisms. It's one of the few ways of extending life in a rat or a mouse.
Well, they've done that. The caloric restriction they've done across like dozens of species, right?
Like ringworms and yeast and fruit flies and things like that. Yeah, it seems to be pretty. You're not going to be able to kind of prove that in a human, I don't think. But yeah, calorie restriction.
You won't be able to prove the longevity because people won't comply and because it's such
people live for a long time. But I mean, it seems that you know, if humans are anything like other mammals or smaller organisms or you know, I mean, because it seems to be a very consistent thing in the literature that calorie restriction is, you know, one of the few ways to extend the lifespan of an organism. So you're probably getting some of those benefits. Back when I first started doing, and you know, science is continually evolving, but when I started doing the research on fasting, I was less convinced that the feeding window really mattered. But the more the research comes out, comes out, I've sort of refined my thinking a bit on it, and I do think that it is probably wiser to begin your feeding sort of earlier in the day, and to stop eating earlier in the day as well, because we're these diurnal creatures, and the day is when our insulin sensitivity is most primed, and when, you know, our metabolisms are most primed to, you know, burn off ingested energy, store ingested energy, and digest food in a way that's as efficient as it's going to be.
Yeah, my thing with that is, this is not, you know, the thing that you can turn into a scientific paper, but just going by experience. So originally I was like, oh, I'll skip breakfast. You know, I can stay busy. I'll go work out fasted, all of that. Like that'll let me sort of draw this out. But I found myself naturally wanting to eat pretty soon after a workout. Like just the impulse was there. Now I can override the impulse. Like I said, the change or die mechanism of setting a line in my life and being disciplined about it. I'm very good at that. But I did find myself distracted by hunger if I tried to push, you know, 6-8 hours after I woke up before I had my first meal. So I thought, would I actually be better off front loading my calories and then seeing how I do, because my calories were still clocking in at say 1,800 or 2,000 calories a day. I would start getting hungry right around bedtime, but I wouldn't have any trouble falling asleep. I wouldn't have any trouble staying asleep. And then when I woke up, my hunger had reset. So I didn't wake up hungry like I went to bed hungry. So I would essentially have sleep for dinner. So I thought, let me try it and see how I do. And it worked fucking awesome. And so that was when I went from like struggling to make 16 hours to I could push and I could do 18 pretty easily. And with some effort, I could get up to 20. And so I probably averaged 19.5 hours a day fasting for 90 days or something like that. Like I found that relatively easy. 18 I can do as a no-brainer. But it's much easier for me to have my last meal done chewing by 2, in bed by 9, up by 3, 4, first meal around 8, 9. That rhythm works for me.
Yeah, I think you're also at an advantage in that scenario because you're going to bed at 9. I go to bed at like midnight or 12:30. I go to bed a bit later.
Wouldn't the timing sleep guy say that that's a bit too late?
You know, it's probably not ideal.
Is that your natural rhythm though? Because do you believe in chronotypes? Is that a thing for you?
No, I'm not. I don't really. I'm not familiar with any potential research there, but all the sleep authorities, I think, seem to advocate for 8 hours of sleep. You know, 7.5 to 8 hours of sleep.
What do you get if you don't have an alarm?
That's what I get.
Do you get that? 7.5, 8?
Yeah. So even though I go to bed late, I get generally, 7.5 to 8 hours of sleep, if not more, every night. I'm a very good sleeper. And I orient my life in a way that, my sleep is sacred. So my room is very dark. I keep it cool.
How cool do you keep it?
I keep it around 65 degrees.
Do you not wake up cold, or do you just blanket up?
I feel like I'm suffocating unless I'm breathing in cool air.
I hear that.
Yeah.
But 68 for me is the max. I start going below that and I just wake up in the middle of the night. I can't fucking sleep because I'm so cold.
So cold. I mean, I use a warm blanket and I sleep with a pillow on top of my head.
That's interesting. So I sleep with the blankets over my head entirely. I have since I was a little kid. People always like girlfriends and obviously now my wife look at me like, what the fuck are you doing? How do you breathe? I love it. Sometimes I will put the blanket over my eyes because I want that cool air in my mouth.
Yeah.
But for the most part, it's just fucking under the sheets. So I definitely blanket up and I love that. I'm under the covers, but at south of 68, that cold seeps in. And so do you still get the benefits of the cool air? Because I could do more blankets, obviously, but am I getting any benefit at that point? Because I'm not actually cool.
Yeah. That's an interesting question. I don't think that I think that it's really, being cool as you're winding down, because your body temperature begins to lower right before bed. So I don't think that you have to. I'm not sure. I mean, I know a lot of people that are now using these cooling mattresses or these cooling covers.
Yeah.
And they're reporting, anecdotally, improvements in their sleep, for that. But yeah, I don't think that your body necessarily has to be the temperature of the room, but I do think generally just being in a cooler environment. There have also been some really interesting studies, and I cite a few of them in the book where people that sleep in these sort of cooler environments overnight, they tend to see a greater proliferation of brown adipose tissue, which is very healthy, metabolically active. And in those studies, they were not sleeping without covers. They were not sleeping exposed to the air. They were just sleeping in a cooler room.
You hear about that chick that swam the Bering Strait?
I did not.
I really need to look her up because I brought the story up several times. I can never remember her name. But to do that, she had to transition her adipose tissue into brown fat. And she was living in Alaska, if I'm not mistaken. And she took exclusively cold showers. Think about how cold the water would be in Alaska.
Yeah.
And then slept through the winter with the fucking window open and no blankets. That seems like you're just going to get hypothermia and die. But she was able to swim the fucking Bering Strait. That's the space between Alaska and Russia.
It's pretty nuts.
Crazy.
That's cold water. I do regular cold water immersion, and so I will attest that you do acclimate. It does get easier as you start to cultivate brown fat.
Walk me through your strategy. What do you do exactly?
Oh man, well so as I mentioned, the 3 P's of
Peeing,
detoxification and perspiring. So
yep.
sauna is a huge aspect.
We're going to get to that in a minute because
Okay.
you talked about that in your book. I've gone deep on cold stuff, but not the heat. So I want to go full blown on that in a minute. But what's your cold setup?
So I go into have I'm fortunate enough to be able to go to gyms and spas that have cold pools, cold plunges.
Yep. What are they at? 55?
They're at 50, 48 to 50.
Ooh,
48 to 50.
48 is that'll get your attention.
Yeah, and very recently I had the opportunity to do 42, which was
that's got to hurt. Like at that point, it's not just cold; it's actually painful.
I think it's very much a mind over matter thing because even I was able to do 4 minutes under 42 degrees, and I feel like once you're able to do
up
4
to
minutes,
your neck,
up to my neck. You really want to make sure
up
that
to your chin.
Yeah,
for those not watching at home, that wasn't just neck.
Yeah, it's like basically up to here. Like
okay,
up to the chin, pretty much.
48 degrees.
You accumulate brown fat. It's not everywhere that you find brown fat. It's around the collarbone. It's in the back of the neck. It's along the spine, under the armpits. So if you're just going up to waist depth in the pond or whatever it is that you're using for your cold water immersion, I don't think that you're getting the full range of benefits. So I'll sink myself. I'll do 4 to 5 minutes. I do it until I basically can't do it anymore. And the level of mental acuity that I feel afterwards is just like almost pharmacological in terms of it's like how powerful it is. It's amazing.
How long does it last for you? That acuity?
It lasts for a while, and I would contrast it to. So if I were to do sauna, I feel really good after a sauna, but I do feel kind of lethargic.
Yes.
And that can persist through the rest of the night pretty much.
That's my next question. So now I want to know your whole heat routine. And well, so let's wrap up the cold. So you do the cold, it's immersion, it's up to your chin. It's as long as you can take it. It's roughly 48 to 50 degrees.
Yeah.
And we do that how often?
I do that 3 to 4 days a week. I don't do it after exercise, directly after exercise. There seems to be a growing body of literature that's suggesting that it's actually sort of counter to the anabolic stimulus.
You want the inflammation.
Yeah, you want a little bit of the inflammation. But I
When
actually...
do you do it then? Before? Late at night?
I'll do it hours later or on days where I'm not doing like resistance training. But I actually have like low back issues. And so for me, countering that inflammation... Yeah.
How did you get low back issues?
From like just being stupid and not warming up under the squat rack a couple of years ago.
From squats.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to say deadlift for sure.
No.
And this has persisted.
It's persisted, yeah. It's way better though, thanks to like all these different modalities, eating an anti-inflammatory diet in general, exercising as much as I can, staying active. I mean, ironically, staying active, which, people with back pain are going to be like, oh, it's like, it's groan inducing, but it's the best thing that you can do.
The only time my low back ever hurts is when I stop
Yeah.
deadlifting.
Yeah.
Not when you can deadlift heavy and really fuck yourself up, so be super careful. But mid-range stuff that I can do 12 reps of, that kind of thing. If I'm doing that consistently, I'm fine. Never have back pain. When I stop, then I get trouble.
Yeah. Yeah, staying active is crucially important. But cold immersion is a great modality for pain relief. It's just amazing. It's good for mental acuity. It's good for I find that it powerfully improves my mood if I'm anxious or I'm feeling depressed. And I'm not the only person to talk about this. Like Wim Hof, he's talked about the mood boosting effects of cold immersion. But for me, I think it's super powerful, and the metabolic benefits I think are among the most interesting and most important aspects of cold immersion. So whether it's just ambient room temperature or doing regular cold immersion, they're showing that just modulating the ambient temperature of your environment can boost glucose or glucose tolerance, insulin sensitivity in the body, can help boost your metabolic rate and things like that. So for anybody struggling with slow metabolism or insulin sensitivity issues, I think that this is a really underappreciated modality that can help potentially boost your health.
Yeah, and you really go into it in the book. This was one of my favorite sections. So now take me into the heat. So this is one of those, it's been on my radar, but because it's not, and maybe I just haven't done it because I've never done a sauna, and maybe that's the problem.
You've never done a sauna?
No, never. And I have one in my house.
Damn.
So I'm going to try it. Like after reading the book, I was like, I legitimately can't believe. Yeah. So anyway, I need to do it. It's fucking ridiculous. So the reason I haven't done it though is because warm is deeply comforting to me. So the cold sucks. Cold hurts. I don't want to do it. Therefore, I do it. I don't have any fears around heat. So it's like, it just seemed too easy. It seemed too easy to be beneficial. So I've just never done the research. So reading your book, I was like, fuck, like there's actually a lot going on. Like I'll say that you sold the heat exposure even better than you sold the cold exposure. So like you put the list down of like people that do like 2 to 4
2 to 3
saunas a day, like a week, versus like the reduction in Alzheimer's or heart disease,
in stroke,
fucking crazy,
Alzheimer's disease, dementia. Yeah, I mean, a lot of this research is coming out of the University of Eastern Finland, which is an amazing place to have this research being done because Finland is the sauna capital of the world.
And they do dry sauna, right? So no steam.
So actually, dry and wet sauna are different from steam rooms. A steam room is a steam room, and then you have dry and wet sauna.
Yep.
A dry sauna basically just means that you can't throw water on the rocks, and a wet sauna is,
And what's the difference in terms of its impact?
I think it's just a preference, personal preference.
Okay, so from a study perspective, because you specifically call out in the book that it was a dry sauna, so I was like, oh shit, I won't do the water thing.
Well, that I believe is what they sort of looked at in the research. In Finland, it's the most common, I guess, sauna modality. Although it's a combination of dry and wet. But I think in the U.S., most people think about wet sauna as steam. And in fact, that's what I thought. I thought a steam room was a wet sauna.
So did I.
Yeah,
to be honest.
But it's actually not. So I think I refer to saunas in general as being dry saunas because most people in the U.S. sauna is not as common. Most people have, at least in the gyms that I have access to, all that's available to me are steam rooms.
And they have different impacts, or it's just not studied yet?
Not studied yet. So probably similar impact. I personally my personal preference is, well, the research is on the side of the sauna. It's coming out of Finland. People in Finland are using dry saunas for the most part. They're not using steam rooms. And so if you want sort of the research on your side, you've got to do the dry.
So walk me through the benefits, because they were legion.
Yeah, they're legion. I mean, for one, using a sauna acts like an exercise mimetic.
And what temperature are we talking about here?
About 200 degrees, 175 to 205 degrees is like the range.
Sit in 205?
Yeah, it's great. It's like a Russian banya. It's like amazing. Not for very long.
I was gonna say, like, so you're not a doctor, blah blah blah. Consult your physician.
Yes,
but give me ballpark temperature, because I'm gonna do whatever you tell me to do.
Yeah, I mean, I was in a sauna last night, and it was about 203
Jesus
degrees. Yeah, it was very hot. It was
and
a Russian
in there
banya.
for how? I don't know what that means.
It's like classic old Russian, old school, like very hot, pretty much.
Okay, so 203-ish degrees, and you sit there for how long?
I mean,
that's like an oven, dude.
I know, it's an oven. If it's my first go around, I'll be able to stay in for, 15, 20, 25 minutes. So it's not an extreme amount of time, but as you do a couple of rounds, your tolerance sort of diminishes, and that's when your tolerance diminishes
in the same day or
same day.
Okay,
your tolerance
if I
increases over
once a day.
Yeah, if I think over the macro, your tolerance does increase. You acclimate, and that's been, I think, shown in the literature as well. But in the micro, it's just like exercise. I mean, like you're not as strong on your last set as you are on your first set.
And sorry, you were saying that it's an exercise mimetic, so it mimics some of the effects of exercise.
Of aerobic exercise, like mild to moderate aerobic exercise. You can feel this if you sit in a sauna. You put your finger over the radial artery in your wrist, and you'll notice it starts to beat. If you look at your heart rate, it's similar to what it would be if you were jogging on a treadmill.
Really?
Yeah, and in fact, I've never
done this. It's ridiculous.
It's amazing. It's truly, I think, medicinal. And there's even been moments in the sauna where one of the indicators of high intensity exercise that's reaching like a lactic threshold is you fail the talk test. You're no longer able to talk while you're exercising.
Okay, right. I thought you were saying in the sauna. I was like, Jesus,
well, no,
get out.
It can. I mean, I've been in the sauna where it's been so hot where I've actually had to get out because it's so hot I can't even like talk anymore. So, but that's the point at which you want to like exit the sauna.
People pass out in these fucking things?
I've never seen it. You don't want to pass out.
Yeah,
you don't want to pass out. But you do want to bring your body to a point of discomfort, because this is another
at 205 degrees. You're going to be deeply uncomfortable. Arizona is uncomfortable. So
there you go.
205 degrees. Jesus.
It's
okay.
hot.
Now I'm scared. That's good. That makes me want to do it more.
It gets hot, but you schwitz, you sweat. And sweating, so aside from the fact that it kind of gives you get like a cardio workout, and it boosts blood flow, it increases nitric oxide. So, I mean, if you've ever had, just to sort of paint a picture, if you've ever had an injured joint or a swollen ankle and you put a hot compress on it, it brings blood to the surface, right? It gets really warm and red, and it promotes healing because it boosts nitric oxide, and it brings nutrients to the area of injury. The same thing happens on a full body scale when you sit in a sauna, because you're essentially applying a hot compress to the entirety of your body. So it's amazingly healing, and that's one of the reasons I think why it's been associated with such dramatic risk reductions for stroke, for heart disease.
Do you do this shit at night, the morning, midday? Where am I at?
Well, heat
it's
actually
raising my heart rate, so it makes me worry about doing it too close to bedtime.
You probably don't want to do it too close to bedtime because, for that reason, because it can be an exercise mimetic. Exercise acts like a time setter as well. You don't want to do it too close to bedtime. In fact, I would say if there is an optimal time to do sauna, you probably want to do it post-workout, because actually heat seems to potentiate the anabolic effects of exercise adaptation and the like. But I'll do it. When I do it, I tend to do, because I go to a place that has a hot and cold. I do what's called contrast therapy. So I'll sit in the sauna for 25 minutes, and then I'll go cool off in the cold, and then I'll go back and forth. And so you can
Is there research on that? Because I worry that that's a bit like doing the cold after the exercise, where if you're going to do the hot, do the fucking hot. And if you're going to do the cold, do the cold.
Yeah.
And that mixing the two sounds like, and I'm wildly ignorant on this, so I could be totally wrong, but intuitively that feels wrong.
Yeah, like one would negate
Yeah,
the
that
other.
they're going to like, you're sort of on the path of one, your heat shock proteins are kicking off, and then you go cool down.
Yeah. I'm not actually aware of any research that would like show that would be a negative thing. If anything, I would think because it's this accumulation of stress, if you're doing it on a day where you haven't gone to the gym, for example, I think probably the net is positive. But I couldn't tell you. Contrast therapy, I haven't seen any direct research on contrast therapy, but it is a modality that's been used traditionally.
You hear people talk about it a lot. For
eons.
sure.
Yeah, I mean, they do it in Finland. And that's where they're
They go out in
seeing
the
all
snow
these benefits.
and they come back in.
Yeah, in fact, I had the privilege of getting to do it in Finland recently. It was so much fun. And then I think it's pretty clear that perspiring, you release all kinds of certain heavy metals,
Cadmium, I'm told.
cadmium, BPA, phthalates.
You sweat out BPA?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Hey guys, thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed that, you're gonna love this.
I co-founded and run Belcampo. We're a ranch-to-table livestock operation. So we sell premium, organic, carbon impact positive meats directly to consumers. Now, after COVID, a lot of that is through e-com and grocery. We also have restaurant butcher shops. But broadly, we're looking to sell directly to consumers a meat that's really, really high quality and farm in the right way, regeneratively, with an attention to the soil quality, soil health, and animal wellness as a underpinning of human wellness.
It's amazing. I've been up to your farm and I saw firsthand what you guys are doing. It's incredible. Like the cows are treated like queens.
Yeah, I know. It's a pretty magical operation. I mean, the piece that's interesting is that often when you do the right thing on the ag side, the right thing happens on the taste side. So I think it's important to say we do it for the right reason, but it also tastes much better by going slow. And that's like in my own background, working early in my career in Europe, a lot of what I saw was very traditional agriculture, the slow going, old fashioned ways of doing things tended to just yield the best quality products. So we've, in the US, we've kind of started to confound hyperpalatability with deliciousness. Okay. But if you unpack that, if you educate yourself to detach hyperpalatability from deliciousness, and you relearn deep nutrition, you relearn how to taste things for flavor and health. When you take yourself down that learning path, you're going to learn to taste for nutrition, and you're going to gravitate to products that are farmed in the way that Belcampo farms.
I mean, it's truly intuitive eating, right? Like being able to listen to the signals that your body is giving you by way of your taste buds and your stomach, which is something that I think that whole system, that whole machinery gets short-circuited in the modern food environment.
So this is something that I have started to practice in my life. It's I'm obviously pretty woo lady, but like what I started to do, I used to think of cravings as something that was bad. Like cravings are for sugar, cravings are for carbs, like you want to avoid cravings. But now I've started to really look at my cravings, and sometimes I'll do it if I'm hungry and I'll like think about different foods and just say, what's like really deeply appealing to me right now? It's kind of a funny question to ask yourself, like just saying like a lot of times I don't want sugar or something. Okay, just put that aside on you. But like look at what's in your fridge and say what's deeply, and sometimes it is sugar and they'll go with it. But like that's an interesting thing to kind of educate yourself around. Is like, what is like, feels like it's going to be deeply gratifying right now. It's not going to really be ever too surprising, but sometimes you're going to find some things that end up sinking in really well. Because sometimes I think we force ourselves to eat what we think we should eat. And then we say, but paying attention to what I want is what I need to do. Because that's willpower, saying no to what you want. But if you can reconfigure want as like deep need and nutritional need, you can actually turn it into kind of a superpower on nutrition.
You're so right. I do that sometimes, and I find that a lot of the times what I want is just something to do. I eat a lot of the time out of boredom. or just being in close proximity to my kitchen. But yeah, I can totally appreciate that. Oftentimes we have these sub-perceptual signals of nutrient yearning that maybe get sort of disguised as just wanting to eat sugar and carbs and rapidly digested, easily accessible foods. But I think, yeah, if you can unpack that, there's probably some deeper wisdom there.
So there's all this neat like research around goats that shows that they will, when they have stomach issues, just naturally gravitate towards bitter herbs and seek out bitter herbs in a pasture with lots of different types of herbs. So there's, in nature, animals had that, that sort of like intuition of like my stomach hurts, so I'm going to have something with a natural antimicrobial, because we know bitter herbs all have a heavy antimicrobial base. So I'm going to go for things that are naturally antimicrobial as an animal. So I think that you and I as humans still have that in us. We see it in our animals in our pastures, right? But we still have that kind of intuition. So it's something I've really like, and there's certain things you can coach yourself to do, and there's certain things like for me, bone broth in the morning wasn't always my craving, but it's become enough of like a health elixir for me that I'm like, I do crave it now because I crave the result. I crave the calm. Like I crave the feeling that I get as a result of doing the right thing in the morning, which is like go kind of heavy on the protein in the AM and I'm going to feel good all day. So you can kind of coach that through willpower, but I think the end result's interesting to explore because if you kind of give yourself that optionality to say, it's not about a meal plan, but it's about like, what exactly am I craving right now? It can yield good fruit.
Yeah. So let's talk about cooking. What, in terms of the bone broth that you consume every morning, what is that?
Okay. I, of course, sell bone broth at Belcampo, and often I do consume that bone broth, but I also cook a lot because I do all the social media for Belcampo, a lot of those, in my own social, and also just I do R&D for our company, so we were downstairs tasting meatballs. That's a product that I developed with our team. I cook a lot. It's also my stress relief and I love it. But I love my bone broth jam lately. I've been putting tongue in bone broth because tongue has tons of collagen in it.
Wow.
And it adds a really nice viscosity. So I love a beef and poultry blend. I also like to put shiitake and flavorful mushrooms into bone broth. I typically make it out of roasted bones, and I also will infuse it at the end with a ton of fresh ginger. So then it's like I make mine incredibly concentrated. Sometimes I'll cut like half and half with Belcampo broth and then leftovers. But when I roast chicken a lot, and I'll just keep all the scraps from that. I'll usually spatchcock it, so cut the spinal cord out first, keep that raw in the fridge. Maybe I've got 2 spinal cords in the fridge, then toss those together with all my leftover bones and make that broth. Now that's an interesting thing because if you look at a chicken, like our chickens at Belcampo are like $25. Right, it's incredibly expensive, which is amazing because it at a lot of kind of high end organic groceries, you'll see a whole roast chicken is $8 or something, right? So it's cooked and everything. It's amazing to me. The efficiencies in chicken are tremendous, which I think many consumers see that and they're like, okay, well I can't afford the good chicken, but the better beef I can. I look at it differently. I think, well, the one with the greatest price discrepancy is probably the one that you as a consumer should be most kind of concerned about, right? Because if they're so vastly, it's not like all the chicken farmers in the small alternative world are just making bank. The reason why it's so much more expensive is that raising it holistically is just so much more expensive. So it's typically like 4 times what it costs for like a regular organic chicken for a pastured organic chicken like a Belcampo one. I mean,
that's always blown my mind. So I'm glad that you brought it up. When I go to even like a high-end supermarket, you'll see an entire rotisserie chicken for $6. So how are they able to produce that and cook it and bring it to market so cheaply?
So it's even more amazing because in the grocery stores, you look at, there's multiple layers of margin there. So in the grocery store, if the farmer sells it for $3, the grocery store is probably selling it for $9 or $10. And their margin is still, the 40%. It's that there's a distributor and a broker involved as well. So with chicken in particular, what you got to think about is that the days, for any animal, the days that it's alive is the cost. Okay, that's really, and whatever cost per day is also important. So in the case of like a, very intensive chicken farm, whatever the costs are per day. But broadly, it's the length. It's the length of life is the major discrepancy between that supermarket chicken and a farmer's market chicken. So a farmer's market chicken, like a Belcampo one, is like 10 weeks to come to full age and maturity. So 2.5 to 3 pounds. It'll take 10 weeks to grow from a little fluffy chick to that same weight. For a conventional chicken, even in an organic operation, it will take 2.5 to 3 weeks. Okay, so that number of days, it's just 4x. And that's actually, ironically, like exactly the price discrepancy that you and I just talked about, like $6 for the grocery store chicken and $24 for a Belcampo chicken, just 6 times 4, right? So it takes 4 times as long to grow. It costs 4 times as much. Because directionally, it's all the same inputs. You know, the chickens, they're monogastrics. They have one digestive tract, so they eat nutritionally dense food, seeds, other animals, things like that. They can eat grass as well, but they don't eat much of it because they, just like us, they want the high fiber things as a supplement, not as the main source of calories. So chicken, though, it's just about the question of length of time. So the slow growing birds like we produce, they cost a lot more because they take a lot longer to grow. Those guys that are doing it organic, but in confinement, the reason it's growing so quickly is typically it's like kind of effectively like a stress response. You know, they're in a darkened environment. They don't move. They're high cortisol levels and they're inactive. So of course they're going to gain weight and have an inflammatory response.
Wow. So they're much younger then. They're like younger chickens, these cheap.
That are much, much fatter.
Yeah.
And then it's also interesting because even with the same breeds, the body conformity is really different. This is the piece where I want more consumers to like connect the dots. Because in confinement animals, you see these like really indicative physiological characteristics that have to do with large guts and puffy. It's just, to me, it looks a lot like, you know, some of the, especially in pigs, right, which is actually the most genetically similar to humans. You actually get more of like adipose and visceral fat.
Wow.
Okay, so it's exactly similar to obesity in humans,
Yeah.
you know, and so they gain weight in these environments where the animals are sedentary. And they're under stress. They actually gain weight in the same unhealthy ways that humans do when they have similar kind of lifestyle. So it's kind of like a lifestyle that's similar kind of effect on how your adipose and visceral fat's aggregating. So whereas our chickens are going to be leaner and more muscular, and they're not going to have that same level of like visceral fat too. Actually, you know, the visceral fat's a key health indicator for humans, right? Something I track in myself, and you actually see it in our birds. They just don't have that fat around the viscera.
Wow.
So it's very different. So your chickens, though, I mean, as a consumer, you need to be most worried when the expensive product is way more expensive, right? Like, because in the case of beef, I really shouldn't say this, but it's like, you know, it's different. It's 18 months versus 26 months. Okay, like that's a big difference, but it's not 2 weeks versus 10 weeks. That's like kind of terrifying, you know, to take the same kind of growth trajectory.
Yeah.
Right. So, but when getting down to the culinary side of that, so if I drop my $25 on a chicken, there's no way I'm going to get 4 chickens of nutrition out of that. Right. That's impossible. But the question then becomes, okay, how do you actually make that worth it? Right. And so one thing that you will learn if you go down and start to try these different types of products is that slower growing musculature also yields slower growing bones and greater bone density. It's effectively higher caliber viscera and everything.
Wow.
So it's amazing. You got some spare time someday, just get a conventional chicken bone and chicken bone from a Belcampo or any kind of quality regenerative farm. And you can snap the bones for a conventional one in your finger.
Wow.
Just like a toothpick. And our bones, you can't, because it took 4 times as long to grow to the same. It's like a tree that grows really quick compared to one that grows slow. Of course, it's going to be more solid, right?
Yeah.
So then if you've got that higher quality viscera, things like broth, where you're actually melting all of that good quality out of every aspect of the animal. So kind of the flip side of the equation, because I kind of scratch my head where I'm like, how do I make this more accessible? And unfortunately, the paradigm in the US around subsidies and the way the world works, I don't know how to. It's not something like with massive scale that this gets way cheaper. It gets a little cheaper, but let's say it goes from 24 to 19, right? It doesn't go from 24 to 6 with scale. It doesn't go from 24 to 6 unless I put those animals indoors. So that's a real problem, you know, and that's kind of like the challenge in my world now is like, how do I then take that product and make it appealing to a consumer and teach them ways where they can use that and teach them the benefit? Because there's days that I wake up and I'm like, well, maybe I just shouldn't do chicken, you know, because it's so much more expensive and it's so hard to get people to see the value in it. So that's something but from a consumer perspective, it's like make a broth out of the bones. Assume that when you spend more on it, every single piece of it is going to have tons more flavor. The other thing that you're going to notice is that you do have satiety faster, right? Because there's more flavor. And that kind of like that, it's not hyperpalatability flavor. It's like complex and challenging flavor. But that flavor is going to be something that shows up in everything you make out of it, right? So that broth is going to have more complexity and flavor. It's going to last longer. It's going to be more filling. So there's like these kind of like soft externalities of these products that are hard to quantify and sell, but they're really important and they're costly to make.
Super important. So it's sort of like a missed opportunity if you're buying a high-end bird, like a Bel Campo bird, and not making bone broth, because the bones are so much more robust in terms of their mineral content. Yeah. And you mentioned earlier that you make bone broth after roasting the bones. You don't just throw raw bones into the soup. You can do
both. So when bones are amazing in the fetus of any animal, including humans, bones are first a matrix of collagen. So as the fetus grows in a cow or an embryonic animal, it's going to be a matrix of collagen. And then that collagen through diet calcifies, right? So the animals are eating grass or whatever that's got calcium in it. And then that collagenous matrix actually calcifies. That's how bones are made in a body. So when you're boiling it, you're effectively undoing the making of it. You're extracting that collagen out of that calcium matrix, and you're also pulling out some calcium as well. But then around all the bones is just the collagen. So things like fascia, right? You hear about fascia when you get a massage, right? Fascia is that's what we call in the butchering side of things, it's silver skin or muscular sheaths. And so the fascia are basically sheaths made out of a tough network of collagen that actually really allow the muscles to move smoothly against each other. When you boil the bones down, you're taking that collagen is going to remain hard and tough if you cook it fast. So have you ever had the experience where you cook a steak and it's got like kind of like some white chunks on the outside? They don't dissolve. Yeah. And then you eat it and you're like, got
it's like the most chewy thing ever.
That's silver skin. So that's basically the part of the musculature that's designed to allow the muscles to slide against each other inside the body. So you can't do anything hot with that. You actually have to do a long, slow, moist cook. And that will dissolve the collagen out of there. Now, there's some other really good things you can do, though, with those cuts. And, we talk a lot about like collagen in bone broth, and then people take collagen in powders. But, the best way to get collagen is just to make stew. We were eating carnitas downstairs, and carnitas are so rich in collagen. And you've had that experience, too. You eat stew or something, and it's like not fatty, but you feel really full. It's because it's so high protein with a liquefied collagen. And you also kind of get that, it's like that mouthfeel, sticky. And it's not greasy, it's sticky. That's collagen. So you can even learn to feel it like on your lips, like that kind of like this touch of collagen. And that's like this kind of tacky, nice. And that's really filling, really nutritious. So things you can do to get that out quickly, you could take a whole lamb shoulder, sear it, cover it in water, put it in the oven for 3 hours, and you're going to get really soft meat and you're going to get tons of collagen. So it's something to experiment with as you're on your like optimal health path. The more food nutrients you can get in their natural availability, you have greater bioavailability. So the challenge for those of us who are interested in meat-based nutrition is, I think, to cook more to get that or find products that have that. And the steaks that we celebrate on a cow, actually kind of like one of the more like nutritionally impoverished parts of the cow.
Nutritionally impoverished. That's because they're essentially just pure protein.
Which isn't bad, right? But they don't have you taught me about like the rate limiting pathway, right? For the metabolism like of the
glycine, methionine.
Yeah. So you can't fully metabolize just pure striated muscle. You need to mix it in with other types of protein to help metabolize it and break it down.
Yeah, I mean, I think you do fully metabolize the protein in meat, but you also, there's this thinking, and it largely comes from, animal studies, rat studies in particular, that show that rats on a methionine-enriched diet, which methionine is very abundant in muscle meat, not as much so in collagenous tissue, that there's a shortening of lifespan, but that effect is actually abolished when they're given supplemental glycine as well, which to me is like a major... it's a sign that maybe nose to tail animal consumption is something that nature had intended for us.
Well, we used to eat more braised meat than grilled meat. And I think that braised meat has just a huge health functionality, and it also takes more value of the animal. right? So nose to tail, it's actually about optimally using the whole animal because most of the animals, what holds it together, and then the actual muscles that pull it are relatively like unimportant, and they're less volume.
Yeah.
So if you're thinking about ways to eat for health, I mean, liver and stuff is part of it. You know, eating your organ meats is definitely, if that's your jam, great. But just getting into the habit of making a weekly braise can be transformative from a health perspective because you're going to get so much more collagen that you'll really notice it in your skin and hair and nails and gut. So I don't think we tend to want to like, I feel like there's a supplement culture in the US, which is great. And it works, and especially because we eat poor quality food. We need supplements now. But sometimes we take, you know, what's good from things and just immediately say, let's put that in a bottle.
Yeah.
And sometimes I say, like, let's just take a step back, right? And say, great, if I'm on the road and I'm taking my collagen supplement, that makes sense, right? But when I'm at home and I have the time and bandwidth, I should be getting some beef shoulder, a lamb shoulder. So everything that's a shoulder in the animal, because we have so much mobility in the shoulder, there's tons of connective tissue here. Any muscle that needs to move in a lot of different ways and has a complex function in the animal is going to have a ton more connective tissue. So and just like that's large load-bearing shoulders like we have on lamb and beef and pork. That's why things like, you know, Boston butt or pork shoulder are so famous for braising, right? Because there are ways to liquefy all of this connective tissue. And then the muscles like the ones along the loin, those actually are the precious cuts, right? The ribeye and the New York, and they surround the spinal cord of the animal. So in a cow, you got the legs and the spinal cord right down the middle. It's just a big slice of meat because it's not really active. You know, where all the action is those shoulders and those thighs. That's just holding the spinal cord in place. And then there's lots of muscles that surround the gut. Okay. So that muscle is very lean it's very tender and mild because it doesn't get much motion. And then functionally, it doesn't have a lot of moving parts. So what you're eating when you have the ribeye is kind of like this unexercised or least exercised part of the animal. It's still, in a free range animal, going to be pretty oxygenated, have that nice deep red color, have a lot of richness and flavor. It's not going to be bland ever. But I'm just saying you're choosing a cut that's like, because often in the US now we've come to kind of conflate two things, right? And because we receive a lot of marketing. We conflate industrial convenience with optimal delicious, right? So we've been taught for years that, you know, white and very lean pork is the best pork. Now that's just kind of an industrially convenient food, right? For the pork industry produce. That's nothing to do with quality. That's nothing to do with flavor. You know, in the same thing goes with like a ribeye versus like a flat iron. Okay, it's just really convenient to market the ribeyes because there's 10 or so of them on each side of the beef. You know, there's 15 or 20 of those kind of prime steaks in every animal, and there's only 2 flat irons. That's a pain to get and to market, right? So these things that we need to always look at this like critically, saying, okay, take a step back from the price point of these different cuts. And then we're talking at the start of the conversation about looking at your pantry, looking at your fridge and being like, what am I kind of vibing on right now, right? But the same thing true, like for me, I enjoy eating a ribeye, no problem. But if I actually look at like how I feel, if I make like I'm feeling hungry talking about this, like a braised like beef shoulder, and I braise it with like, you know, blackened shiitake mushrooms, and then I pull it out the next day and I toss some like carrots in there and some shallots. That's like good eating. That like makes me feel amazing. That makes a ribeye look like a snack, you know, like that's actually a deep, and I think it's because it's like, it's kind of checking more boxes for my health. So that's where I think if you kind of pay attention to your actual, not just your emotionality, but your visceral response to foods, you can kind of coach yourself to take on more and to cook, you know, to try more things. And you might actually find that like that $9.99 cut of beef clawed, right, is doing more for you than your $39.99, you know, ribeye. Right?
Isn't that so interesting that more expensive cuts could actually be better for you, and that cheaper cuts could be better for you and more nourishing than the more expensive, more prized cuts of meat? Talking about accessibility, right? And like and food equity. I think that's an important point that you bring up.
Well, we've really loved the grill in the US. We love throwing stuff on the grill. And there's kind of a piece of that too, where I'd say, you know, you can also take a book from like all of Asia, like take a page from their book, where a lot of these cuts too, you can braise them, but you can also just like, you can pop them in your freezer, cut them really thin against the grain, and throw them on a hot pan. I mean, there's like a style of cooking that's kind of like in a lot of Asian countries, you see that fundamentally there's not really cuts of beef. They kind of just cut all the beef the same way, and then they'll prepare it in a certain way. So it's like either boiled or it's cut really thin and cooked hot and fast. So there's kind of ways to work around it. But this idea that there's certain cuts that are precious and less precious, it's like that's really the economics of the animal. And you need to educate yourself and empower yourself to try the different things. You may find that you really like tongue and just incredibly inexpensive and super nutritious, right?
Yeah.
Now there's definitely certain cuts that are going to be, chewier and more complex and harder to get your head around. Like it's not like this is an absolute, there's a reason why ribeyes are famous and delicious, But I think that what we're seeing right now is a kind of a generational shift. Like I'm seeing in people doing carnivore and trying like rendering their own suet. They're doing, they're trying to make liver. That's like the question I get the most on Instagram now is like, I just got this liver. I really want to eat it. And that's amazing. Like if I had thought 2 years ago, people would be DMing me being like, I want to eat more liver. That's never ever going to happen. So these are some shifts that are happening. I think people are kind of discovering this, but liver is like, $5.99 a pound. It's like incredibly inexpensive.
It's so cheap. I love it. And I have such a big problem cooking it because neither of my brothers will go near it. So I have to buy it. And generally when I buy it, I know that I'm going to be the only person eating it, but I'm such a big fan.
How do you cook it?
I will generally sear it in very hot ghee. I find that ghee is the most, and I welcome your thoughts on this, but I find that it's like the most complementary. It's got the most complementary flavor profile to go with the liver.
Yeah.
And then I typically will just throw salt on it, maybe like a squeeze of lime.
Yeah.
My friend Mary Shanuda, who is a friend of yours as well, I believe, she has an incredible recipe that I fell in love with. It involves chicken liver, but I loved it so much that I put it in my first book, Genius Foods.
Okay.
And that was where
she does it with peppers.
She does it with peppers, but she also uses ghee, and that's where I first kind of like made that ghee liver connection.
Yeah.
And I also find a big part of cooking liver, and you're the expert here, but I find it to be really important not to overcook it.
Absolutely.
Like you want it more or less rare. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'd say medium rare. And I think if you're squeamish about the pink in the liver, like don't do a thick slice of it. I would cut it to a 1/4 inch thick. I love ghee. I think for a more economic cooking fat that has the same taste properties, suet is great.
What is suet?
Suet is just rendered beef fat. And so
what's the difference between that and tallow?
Same thing. Suet's a more precious. Suet is actually the visceral fat.
Interesting.
So it's like the fat that surrounds the organs and protects them from the bones inside of the body. So these organs are super tender. The membrane is very, very tender. They don't have any striated muscle structure. So they're like, think about it like people, in boxing, when people get punched in the kidney, it's the most painful thing. So the viscera are very, very tender. And the way that the body protects them is this visceral fat. So they're little pillows of fat that surround the organs in the animal and protect it from any like abdominal injuries and from its own bones. So that fat, like there's different characters of fat within the animal. It's really beautiful. You really see it in pigs as a consumer because bacon cooks very differently than like the fat on a pork shoulder, right? Because they have different kind of functionality. The back fat on a pig is excellent for salami, but makes terrible bacon. It's too crisp for the bacon. So if you actually taste those, you'll taste them differently. It'd be hard to describe it, but some of them are like more poppy and they've got a finer texture. Other ones are a little bit, and it basically has to do with the presence of collagenous tissue and fascia in the muscle, right? That's like the bacon has a little bit more of it, so it's got more chew. So in the beef, that suet actually has a very, very tender fascial structure. And it renders really well. So it's the most precious of the beef fat. And the other fats are, marrow is the most precious fat. And then after that, suet. And then below that is tallow. And tallow is kind of everything else. The other really neat thing about the suet is that it's not attached to any musculature. So it has very little like taint of meat flavor. So if you were just to take a big slab of fat off of a rack of New York's, let's say, of extra muscular fat and just render that out, it'd be really beefy. But suet's just been this kind of little bag of fat within the gut. So it doesn't have any kind of muscle fiber in it. So it has the aging beef flavor. But I've been cooking with it a ton. I did carnivore diet a couple times on and off this year. And in the course of that, rendered a bunch of it just to try it out and love it. And it's also just, I love ghee, but a big jar of good ghee is like $30.
It's expensive, yeah.
Expensive. And I use a lot of fat in my cooking. So I would be tearing through like $30 of ghee a week or something. And so I with suet, you know, I can, it's, you know, basically a third or quarter of the price for Belcampo suet. So it's just much more economical, and it's got the same characteristics, a 450-degree smoke point.
Wow.
And then it's a beautiful flavor. And eggs fried in suet are incredible.
Are they?
Yeah. The really hardcore carnivores just like slice up the suet and kind of snack on it, which is not my jam.
I've seen Paul Saladino do that. He just brought like a bag of suet like over with him.
Yeah.
And was just popping it into his mouth.
Yeah, that's not something I've been able to. Although you couldn't ask for a more enthusiastic woman about meat in general. I'm not going there with the suet chunks.
So wait, because I don't think I've ever seen it in the supermarket. Where can listeners like pick up suet?
We sell it on our site, and then you can get it from a quality butcher.
Got it.
And I actually rendered a jar for you.
Oh,
I'll
amazing.
drop it by. Yeah, but it's very easy to render. You just throw it in a pan and cook it for like 3 or 4 hours, and you pour it off. We sell it whole because honestly, there's not enough of a market for it yet for us to render it out. But there's companies like Fatco is a company that sells rendered suet in grocery stores. It's kind of catching on because now that animal fat's like out of the bad bin, right? Then people are looking at it. And for me, it's just, you know, if you're looking for, even if you're buying good quality avocado oil, it's still going to be more expensive than suet. So for me, suet and lard, hey, I like lard enough. I don't love the porky flavor though on everything. So suet's got that nice, like that bovine mildness, right? So it's more applicable to more things. And then it'll keep you in your fridge for like 6 months.
You know what's interesting from an environmental standpoint? It's probably so much more sustainable to use these beef fats. Like most people are not buying beef fats. There's probably so much that's going into landfills.
We used to pay people. We sell it now, not all of it though. Some of the lower quality stuff we pay people to pick up, and it turns into biofuel.
Wow. But
it's like, I mean, there's a sort of radical shift away from animal fat, and it's not just like all of a sudden everybody woke up and did it. It was I remember, you know, my mom telling me that when she was a kid, that she remembers the point at which margarine became cooler than butter.
Oh God. I think I remember that.
It was like a thing where and she was like, yeah, they used to not be able to sell. It's kind of like with almond milk not being able to be called milk. Now there was a similar type of industry backlash. And so they would sell it in a white block, and then it came with a dye drop, and you'd massage this, like in the 1950s when my mom was a kid or something. So you'd have to stir the color in, and then it was like the miracle of technology that margarine was better. So it's like there's been like billions of dollars convincing us to not cook the meat of the animals we love to eat in the fat of those same animals we love to eat. It's like, no, don't do that. Buy this hyper-processed vegetable, genetically modified, spray your grill with it. Like, it's crazy. From a flavor perspective, from a health perspective, they perform well at the same heat. They taste great together. It's a total no-brainer. But you can make a version of it yourself. And this is something I always recommend when you're cooking is a nice ribeye, if it has a fat cap on it. And it doesn't always, like sometimes it'll be cut off or have aged too much. But if you have some fat on it, even if you have like a nice little like walnut sized piece of fat kind of notched into it where the two muscles of the ribeye meet, cut that out, get your pan hot, rub that piece of fat across the pan, and that will just quickly render fat out.
Wow.
Get that nice and smoking hot, throw your ribeye into that fat. So you can cook animals in their own fat. You can cook your meats in their own fat very easily. You can do the same thing with a pork chop. You should never be like spraying a grill with avocado oil or with Pam. The only case where you'd ever be able to do that would be for a boneless, skinless chicken breast.
Right.
You know, because it's the only cut of meat that doesn't have enough fat on it. So when you're looking at a piece of meat and figuring out how to cook it, like if I'm cooking, let's say a lamb shoulder, and there's one side that's bone, there's one side that's fat. I'm going to heat up my pot, my Dutch oven, and put it fat side down.
Fat side down first.
Render that out, and I'll hear it. It'll be poppy. It'll smell fatty and good. And then once it's rendered out, I'll turn it over. And then I've got my own fat. So there's no need to like put the butter in, burn the butter. You know, you've been there. Like you burn the butter. Then, oh man, I got to like wash the pan out and put new butter in, but watch it like a hawk. Like, no, its own fat will perform really well at the appropriate temperature.
I love that. That was something that the first time you told me that, I was very surprised that when cooking burgers, for example, or steaks, you don't add any additional fat to the pan.
No.
And it doesn't stick somehow.
If you're not, you have to go hot
You have to go hot.
Because you have to render the fat out. You have to make it hot enough that the fat will melt. Because keep in mind that the beef the melting temperature needs to be there. So you can't put it in a cold pan, because if you do that, the proteins will bond to the pan before the fat has time to render out. So it's kind of like a race of the two things. You want to get the fat rendered out before the protein has time to glom onto the pan and attach it, so those proteins like flatten out and cook onto the pan.
Wow.
So if you go hot, they'll throw it in there. Now, if you're working with like a 95% lean, it's not going to work.
Yeah.
It needs to have like at least 10%.
Throw some oil in there.
Yeah, exactly.
So cast iron pan on the skillet, you're turning the flame basically up to high. Like, if the dial goes from 1 to 10, you're putting it at 10.
What I like to do is to put my hand an inch above the skillet. If it's like uncomfortable, that's good. You can't be like, it's comfortable to hang out there. That's hot enough. Then put the part of the meat down that is the most fatty. You'll see it render out. You actually see fat seeping out from around it, and then put the face of the meat that's leaner into that same fat.
It's amazing. And with when you're making a burger, similar concept.
There, I just will put my burger. I'm always using an 80-20 blend, and I'll just throw the burger in with that ground meat in it, like the ground fat in it. It will render out immediately, and it will seize up off the pan.
Talk to me about salting meat.
So salting's complicated because when you salt, you're going to draw a little bit of moisture onto the surface of the meat. So to me, salting the meat a minute or two before, it doesn't really make a difference in the taste quality as when you're salting it partially through the cooking. And you also are pulling a little bit of water onto the surface of the meat that's going to potentially make the surface of the meat gray before it browns. Have you had that happen where you cook meat and it's like grayish first? It's almost like it's been boiled.
If I leave it out for too long.
Okay. But also if you just sear it in a pan, it won't get dark brown. It'll just get more like brownish.
Yes.
That happens when meat's wet. Because what'll happen is that what hits the pan is wet and water, and that'll boil. And then you're kind of boiling the surface of the meat.
Got it. So it's like, because I've noticed when salting steaks, I throw it in the pan, it doesn't get dark. It gets kind of like...
Because you have this little layer of water. That water boils. And so those cells on the surface of the meat, you're boiling them.
Wow.
So they're going to be grayish, not brownish. You want to fry those cells, right? You want them to get brown and crispy. So I actually usually get my fat rendered, put the steak down, and then when I flip it over, that side that's been cooked, I'll salt that.
Got it.
Because if I'm not salting if I'm doing a dry brine or a wet brine or something where it's about the salt penetrating the flesh, of course I'll salt it beforehand. But that'll be like 6 hours beforehand.
Got it.
Maybe 3. So if you're talking about any time within the hour before you're going to cook it, if it feels good to salt it beforehand, it's like fun sprinkling it. Okay, fine. And obviously if you're doing it in the oven, you should do it first. But if you're doing it stovetop and you're watching it, I would recommend just salting it as you flip it.
Got it.
My one kind of caveat to that would be meat that's very dry, which would be like if you have like a 45-day aged dry aged steak or something, you actually might want to salt it beforehand, because in that case, the meat will be so dry, it'll be difficult for the salt to absorb. I also think it's like the idea of a finishing salt is interesting. That's a salt that you're adding more for texture than for flavor. So that might be like, like a Malden salt or a Jacobson's flake salt or a Redmond salt. It's like kind of got a cool textural thing.
I'm obsessed with flake salt.
Okay.
FYI.
How do you use it?
I use it as a finishing salt. I have a little sauce plate or sauce bowl, whatever they're called, on my dining room table at all times with flake salt in it. And I throw it on pretty much everything. I throw it on steak. I throw it on eggs. I throw it on vegetables. I also... I always get looks of bewilderment from the waiters. But whenever I'm in a restaurant, I know that if it's a higher end restaurant, they have some flake salt in the kitchen.
Yeah.
So I'll literally ask for that.
You're that guy.
I'm that guy, but I push the table salt, to the side and I call over a waiter or a busboy and I'm like, can I please get, this like thick flaky salt that sometimes they like finish meat with? Like just ask the chef about it. He'll know. Yeah. And they bring it out for me and it's amazing.
Yeah. It's such a game changer.
I also think for people listening to this, like having flake salt in your kitchen adds like a restaurant quality level of sophistication that is extremely inexpensive, but adds like a lot. Like what it adds is not commensurate with how much it costs.
Well, the thing to know about that, people get flake salt and they're like, but I tore through it and it was so expensive. And the key thing is that when flake salt is in water, It's just the same as regular salt.
Yeah.
So there's really no reason to use it unless you have an application where it can stay totally dry.
Yeah.
So you have to use it once all your food is fully finished cooking. So
It's
you're not going to
finished.
whisk it into your salad dressing. You're not going to add it to you're not going to salt your steak with it before you cook it, because then it's going to pull the moisture out of the steak and it'll immediately just turn into a nice little saline layer
Yeah.
on the exterior of the meat. So I think you just have to be careful about, it's expensive, but you use it in a way that's conscious of it. Because when it melts, it's basically just salt, right? There's really no difference.
Yeah, it's so worth it. I would say that and a good extra virgin olive oil. Like those are the two places where I'm like, spend what you can afford.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
But I love what you were saying about the steaks and not wanting to boil it. I've heard the way that I operate with steaks. Correct me if I'm wrong. So you've definitely challenged the way that I think about salting meat before I throw it on the pan. But I've heard that you can throw it on immediately before you put it in the pan, before it has time to accumulate that water.
Absolutely, sure.
Or like 45 minutes before. If it's like 15 minutes, 20 minutes, you don't want to do that. It's got to be either like 45 minutes to an hour before or longer, or immediately before you throw it on the pan.
Absolutely. And then while we're talking about fat and rendering fat, remember that when you're cooking organs, they do have a lot of fat in them, but the way that the cell structure is, that fat will not render out. So if you're using liver, has tons of fat in it.
Wow.
But if you throw liver into a dry pan, it's not going to render out because it's a very, very fine structure. Okay. So when you're using, that's one place where I think suet is fantastic in that. Ghee is also great. I use probably avocado oil in a pinch for that. But for those, you're going to want to go very hot and fast, because otherwise they'll end up kind of medium throughout, which is not very good. And you want a nice crust, because with the organ meats, the contrast is super important there. You can also, if you were making marrow, you can save the marrow bone fat and use that. If you put marrow bones on a pan and cook them for yourself, put your flaky salt, some lemon zest, some thyme on that. So delicious. And then but you can save what's in the bottom of the pan, because a bunch of fat will end up there. Put that in a jar, just like you might save bacon fat, and then cook your liver and things in that. But with your organ meats, there's going to be no time to render it out because of the way the fat structure is. So that's one where you really need to go abundant on adding fat to the pan first.
Fascinating. When it comes to throwing back to the steaks, because I love myself a good steak, they definitely have to be dry before you throw them in the pan, right? No water.
No water. And
no water.
I wouldn't freak out about like drying them off.
Like with paper towels, like you wouldn't recommend doing that?
If they were very, very moist, maybe, but I'm just going to more like let it dry on a cutting board for a minute or two. It's not about it doesn't take a lot of water to make it grayish, but it should dry off. If it's for whatever reason has like what's called a purge, so a lot of water in the bag, yeah, you could dry it off with a towel. It'll definitely improve the crispness of it. Because, you think about it, you couldn't like fry. It's difficult to fry like a wet vegetable too, right? It doesn't adhere. The fat doesn't crisp in the same way. So getting rid of the moisture is going to improve the crispness and the Maillard reaction that you get from your fat.
I love that. So useful. You also, I believe you allow your steaks in a best case scenario to get to room temperature before throwing it on the grill, correct?
Especially if they're thick. So if I'm talking about a steak that's under 1.5 inches, I'm not going to be worried about it. Because when I put it in the pan, just the heat contact from the pan itself will bring the middle to temp in minutes. But if I'm going north of 1.5 inches, especially north of 2 inches, there's going to be a major gradient issue. So you've had the experience, I'm sure, of like a black and blue steak where it's cold in the middle. You ever had that experience?
I haven't, but I can picture that. It doesn't sound very pleasant.
So that's a really common thing. Take the 2-inch steak out. There's like, I always think of it as like sort of like super bro cooking where you're like, oh my God, this huge steak. And then it's like you put it there and then it's like burnt on the outside and then raw on the inside. So in those bigger chops, the same with roasts, it's very important to do that. And if you can't do that, you actually need to go low and slow first. So the hack, if you have like that 2-inch, you could buy it from Mel Campo, a 2-inch thick tomahawk steak, bone in, but you didn't plan it out and you're running home. You're like, got to get out of the fridge. I would at that point go in my oven with it at 200 degrees and it will turn grayish and you might be a little freaked out, right? I might do it 20, 30 minutes at 200 degrees in the oven and then take it out and hit it hard and sear it. And that's called a reverse sear. So that's like basically you when you're cooking stovetop, you're doing a classic sear sequence. So you're searing on the outside and then the residual heat from that sear is cooking the inside to temp. A reverse sear, you disaggregate that sequence, right? And so you actually take the inside cooking part, do it first at low temp. You do the same thing when you sous vide. Okay. And then afterwards you hit the sear and you focus on the crust. It's a nice process. I feel like it's really good if your personality, if you like really a lot of like control and to really understand the process. And if you are nervous about having spent a lot of money on meat, right? You know what I mean? Like that, it's useful for in that case too, because there you're going to be really sure that you can have it dialed. So if you want your meat to nice, like let's say medium rare, you can put it in your oven at 180 or 200, take it to an internal temp of 125. While you're doing that, you hit that, cast iron stovetop, get it hot as you can.
Super hot.
And then sear it on 3 sides, start with the fat cap, get your fat, and then do the 2 sides. You'll have a perfect steak.
Wow.
Okay. It's a little less sensual and fun, because you're not like touching it and it's smelling good and cooking it slowly. It's a little less delicious from my perspective. But I think if you're like, oh my God, I spent $80 on the steak, I don't want to mess it up. It's a great way to do it. Now, I'm not a fan of sous vide, right? Sous vide is something that I think from a toxicity perspective is really questionable because that's when you're doing that same process of slowly cooking the interior, but you're doing it in a plastic bag in water.
Right.
And there you have a lot of potential for contamination. Those bags, some of them don't have BPAs, but they've got something else that you would know more about than me. But super
God
question.
knows what they put in those, but you just don't know.
Yeah. And
it's never informed consent, right? You don't know what's in those bags. It might not be BPA. It could be BPS. It could be BPF.
And plastics are a liquid, right? And food's liquid. Like everything, the exterior of food's all a porous membrane. Unless you're eating like a coconut, it's going to get right in there pretty fast, right?
And also plastic is made using oil. So oil can actually dissolve some plastics. Not all,
Really?
But that's why you don't want to buy oil or fatty foods if they've been sitting in plastic, especially if they've been sitting in plastic and heat and you don't know how food has been stored prior to it reaching your supermarket.
Yeah. So I've been on Food Network shows for years as a judge. And when I do that, and a lot of that food's cooked sous vide, and I have such a strong inflammatory response to that food that I eat. It all tastes great. It's a really good way to get super dialed precision, but I've avoided using that technique in any of the Belcampo restaurants just because I feel like it's kind of too much, sort of like a microwave where you're like, I know it's convenient, but I feel like there's a cost to this convenience, So, but you can, and you can also do it like on a Traeger or a grill. You can do that reverse sear where you just bring it to temp low and slow. And it's the same concept as a sous vide. Low and slow to cook the interior and then focus on just the searing at the end.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on adding other spices to steaks prior to grilling, like black pepper, garlic powder, things like that?
So, I have a lot of thoughts about sauces. First off, I think it's kind of like doing a cleanse. I think on your health journey, if you decided that cooking was part of like what you want your adult life to encompass, I would recommend starting with simplicity. And I think that a lot of things get masked by a rub or a marinade. And I think fundamentally, really good, clean meat doesn't need it. You should know, sauces are like an inflammatory cocktail. It's typically canola oil, sugar, and soy.
Yeah.
And basically every, like 99% of marinades are basically canola or safflower oil, sugar of some sort, and soy.
Just crap.
And so you're taking kind of nature's perfect food of meat and then putting like this inflammatory cocktail and being like, meat doesn't agree with me. It's like, well, yes. I question that premise, So I think that taking the sauces out of the equation, I had this experience. I get sent so many products, and this person will go unnamed, but a great, like this, I got this really nice rubs. And I noticed my 8-year-old daughter like eating it with a spoon. And I'm like, oh God, that's weird. And I look and it's like the number one ingredient is sugar. It's like, of course she's eating it with a spoon, especially in our like sugar impoverished household. She's like, this is great. I found this like super, and it was yummy. And it was like brown sugar and cinnamon and, it's fine.
It's probably the most hyper palatable thing she's ever had in her life.
So, but keep in mind, like read the ingredients when you do, if you're not making it yourself. Now, a little sugar on meat as an enhancement, a little, I use coconut or agave in salad dressings occasionally. It's great.
Yeah.
But you just have to you have to coach your palate. I think barbecue for me, it's delicious, but I think it's one of the more inflammatory combinations that we have kind of widely available. And there's so much sugar in it. Like that's why you get that kind of like gut bomb feeling from barbecue. It's not pork. It's not the pork. It's not the fat. People are like, it's so much fat. It's like, no, it's the combination of tons of protein and tons of sugar in the same boat is really hard on your body.
Tons of protein, tons of fat,
and tons of sugar.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't tell you how many times people people have messaged me on Instagram telling me that like meat, like they get an upset stomach from eating meat, which I think is so generally unlikely, but you can't really offer advice without knowing exactly how they're eating it. But generally, I would say most of the time that's how people are eating meat.
So then the question would be like, what's the opportunity that I can offer you for a different way, right? So if you're accustomed to putting like your jarred teriyaki sauce on your chicken, what's the other way? So some things I would recommend doing are, you mentioned really good olive oil, really good lemon juice or fresh lemon juice, lemon zest, fresh herbs, parsley, thyme are fantastic. I would recommend starting with that as your palate. So if you take like even a boneless, skinless chicken breast or just a simple whatever lean piece of meat and try that with like a more basic, like a sauce that you're making out of different ingredients that you understand. If you want it sweeter, a great combination is to use some coconut sugar, olive oil, lemon. That's fine. You can also do a chimichurri where you take just basic, like 2 cups of herbs and half a cup of olive oil and a quarter cup of lemon, right? That's a nice combination. That's also really, really unlike the kind of American sauce cocktail of the soy, canola, and sugar.
Yeah.
Parsley, lemon, and olive oil. Those are all like prebiotics. They're great for your digestion. Parsley is a natural antimicrobial. It's a natural gut soother. So many of the traditional combinations of things we ate with meat were all about helping us assist in digesting and taking advantage of this incredibly healthy food. So you look at like charcuterie, right? Traditional preserved pork, a little heavier on your system. It's got like some natural antimicrobials in it. Things that stop the decay of meat also are going to be harder to digest, right? Because we're meat and they're harder for us to digest.
Yeah.
So you always ate those with pickles and mustard and vinegar, right? Things that are and kraut, heavy probiotic load. So we tended, if you look at nutritionally, kind of, I think, ancestral kind of diet approaches, you were taking this superfood and you're combining it with things that made it easier to extract optimal nutrition. And that's where, if you look at what you're combining with your meat, that's the ideal. So for me, it's always in my fridge. It's fresh flat leaf parsley. It's really good olive oil and really good lemon juice, and then whatever salt. Now, beyond that, in terms of what you're going to put on your steak, we were talking about that. I would never recommend any like dry green herbs. Like some people crust it with rosemary. If you're grilling a steak, most that's going to just catch on fire. Okay. If you're doing a wet rub, by all means, your dry green herbs are fine. If you're doing a dry rub, I'm going to always want to stick to not herbs, but spices, because those actually will melt into the surface of the meat and be moistened enough by the water that's coming out in the fat that they won't catch on fire. So but in general, if it's like, I only like my steak with this marinade or this thing, I encourage you to use that as a provocation to be like, and do I have the right steak? It's like the same thing as like, I can only like go out with my boyfriend if I'm drunk. It's like, do you have the right guy?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's like, if you're having to do that much to make it work, is that really like...
You just got a lot of people listening thinking about questioning their relationships.
But I also think a really good thing to learn is just like marinate your meat after you've cooked it. Okay, so we have this thing about marinating the meat beforehand because we associate it with moisture. You know what? The moisture is going to come from the quality meat.
Yeah.
It's really difficult unless you're using an injector, which is what they do like in barbecue competitions, use a big old syringe or a tumbler or something to actually get moisture into the meat. If you want your meat to be moist, use good quality meat. And if you want a delicious marinade, marinate your meat after. Okay, so don't soak your chicken in your teriyaki sauce beforehand. Cook it simple, hot and fast, or however you want to, and then slice it thin against the grain and then toss it with your marinade. And that's going to yield better taste quality. Because when you have meat that's been soaked in water-based sauces and with a lot of sugar in it, the sugar is going to burn. That's going to be the equivalent of the crust, but it's not going to get that deep, complex flavor that you actually get from the caramelization, the Maillard reaction of the protein itself.
God, I love listening to you talk. So my favorite way to eat steak has always been without any type of sauce. I will admit that I do like the Primal Kitchen makes like a steak sauce that I really like. It tastes kind of like A1, but with like better ingredients. I like that. But generally, 9 times out of 10, just that Maldon salt, that big, thick flake salt, on a steak for me. And then I ate at a restaurant fairly recently in LA called Via Veneto's here in Santa Monica. And it was the first time I'd ever had like a really nicely done steak with extra virgin olive oil as a sauce with like a few drops, like just like 2 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil and then a few drops of balsamic vinegar. And it was like the best thing ever.
Game changer.
Game changer. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I learned, and correct, you probably know this way better than I do because you've lived in this part of the world. But is that sort of like a Tuscan mode of eating steak? Is that?
Yeah. Well, it's also interesting, you know, that's a technique that you're going to use in places where the fat is less prevalent naturally in the meat. Okay. So it's interesting. Like there's not many fat-based dressings for our steaks. I mean, people do like a béarnaise, like a butter sometimes, like an anchovy butter on a cool steak. But in general, the American meat has so much fat in it that if anything, you want more of like a steak sauce, which is more of an acid-based. You want acid and sugar to help you handle all the flavor, all that fat.
Interesting.
But in cultures where you have a leaner meat, so that region it's in Tuscany, and the traditional beef is the Maremma breed, which is one of the great weight oxen. These beautiful, huge beasts. The Chianina is another one of those. The Piedmontese. So they actually descended from the Russian steppe oxen. It's a beautiful it's a work animal. So historically, there was like cows that were bred to be tractors, right? Move things around. There's cows that were bred for milk and cows that were bred for meat. And so that animal is a traditional tractor breed. It was used to work the pastures, to pull plows in central Italy. And so the musculature is super lean. I mean, it's like all red, no veins of fat. So what you're going to do with that, then you've got this great beefy flavor, but you add the olive oil because you're adding that fat afterwards.
Adding the fat. Yeah, I had it with a ribeye and it was fire. And ribeyes are pretty fatty. But when you're buying grass-fed, grass-finished beef, like what Belcampo produces, I know it's probably it's going to be leaner in general, right, than like your typical feedlot.
No, it's got like always like 40% less fat.
Wow. And
sometimes we do get, I mean, occasionally you have outliers. You'll get what's like a prime grade, because prime is not a grade around quality. Prime just has to do with how much fat it has.
Yeah.
So our meat is typically, if we're grading it, like it's going to be selector choice, which has nothing to do. People think prime is like cleaner and better source. No, prime is simply about how much fat is available inside the musculature. Okay. So that prime grade is something that for most grass-fed producers, I would have to raise animals till they're much, much older to get there. But you actually, when you're using a grass-fed steak, a fat-based finish, also just melted butter is bomb on steaks.
So good.
And also, and another great thing to use just in terms of natural flavor builds, and people get on this, there's a little bit of obsession, especially in SoCal, with fish sauce, right? People love fish sauce. But I love anchovies, salted anchovies in a steak combination and with pork. So if you look at things that are going to naturally build on, what we like about steak, part of it is this rich umami flavor, which is that like kind of undergrowth, mushroomy deepness. And so if you take anchovies, you actually enhance that flavor. Plus it's a nice like omega-3 boost. It'll be another amazing steak sauce for you to try at home. Just get that nice hard sear, fry it in its own fat cap, and then just soak a salted anchovy or take like a jarred anchovy and cut it up and melt it in some butter. So just like cook it, but like the butter's it's not gonna get crispy. It'll just kind of soften, and smash it with the tines of a fork while you're doing that. So maybe it's like 2 tablespoons of butter and like 2 anchovies, and pour that over the steak. And that to me is like the OG steak sauce, because steak sauce actually historically includes anchovies.
Wow.
In it, because it's got that really, really rich umami flavor.
Aren't anchovies like a staple ingredient in Worcestershire sauce?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that kind of like complex, fishy, like umami flavor is so great combined with steak. And there's also a nutrition powerhouse too.
Could you do that anchovy thing with olive oil? Same
totally,
concept?
Exactly, same thing. Yeah. And you can also blend it. I also will make a sauce really simple with capers, anchovies, olive oil, lemon rind, and parsley, and just grind that up in my Vitamix, like make a little green smoothie, and put that on top of eggs, on top of grilled meats, on top of like kind of boring chicken breast. It's a great combination. That's where if you focus on the sauces that you can have fresh afterwards with the cooked meat, it's always going to be more delicious. I also find that saucing your meat after it's cooked is a much better way to end up with great tasting leftovers. because that kind of like encapsulating the meat with like a parsley, olive oil, lemon sauce, it's a great way to hold it in the fridge and it'll taste really good the next day. So it's like makes it more snackable, more yummy for your leftovers as well.
Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
Immune reactions to different foods. And he had tested like 250,000 people for 20 plus years, every year, 250,000, something like 4 million people. The most or the least reactive food that he ever tests ever is red meat.